All right, I'm going to invite you to sit down if you're here for adult formation. So if you're standing, I'd recommend you get some cake and find your way to your seat. Maybe get some coffee or something to drink. If you're not here for adult formation, just join us anyway. But please have something to eat, something to drink. Elizabeth is also here for the next service, and we'll finish with about 15 minutes before the next service, but not a little bit more, so you can also talk to Elizabeth before that service. And then after the service, get it all in, because she's going on sabbatical. We'll keep talking about what a sabbatical is. Most churches have never had a clergy person go on sabbatical in this way. And we've just come out of COVID isolation, which for many of us meant whatever a boundary was, it's changed in our lives, all of us, not just the clergy. So we're going to work on how we love people and hold them in our hearts and pray for them and let them go on sabbatical. Because it used to be, as someone just told me, you could, if you just left town, people would sort of have to leave you alone. But now, all of you have our numbers that come here. And because we're us, we have one of these, most of us. So even if she turns off her email and forwards it, if you text her or call her, it's going to ring here. And the great thing about a sabbatical would be that Elizabeth spends no time worrying that she hasn't responded to your text or call. So what I've asked her to do is, if there's anything that needs to come here, including something like tough or something great, to tell me. And so I will try to figure out how we do that in a way that honors her privacy and her time for these 3 months. But also, I might suggest, and I might regret this, and we might have to find a new way to do it, but if you just really feel the need to write her because you're worried about her or you love her or you write her every day and this is so hard, maybe don't, if you can. Like write them all down and give her 3 months worth when she gets here if you want. It's one way to do it, so that she can know that you never stop thinking about her if you need to do that. But also, if you're just really worried or something like that is happening, send me a note and let me figure out how to do it. So the idea would be that coming out of this pandemic time, we all have to learn how to reestablish our boundaries around work and family and what's right and good. Like some people are rethinking how they eat, how they drink. Like it got weird for a couple of years. So this in the church, as you can imagine, for lay staff or clergy staff, a lot of what we know are best practices have just fallen away because we want so badly to be connected and to take care and to be pastorally attentive. And the other way around, right? There's all kinds of decline in systems because it's overwhelming, right? We just got behind and everybody feels bad about that. Elizabeth's sabbatical is a moment for all of us to do some resetting, and we're going to do that over the summer. So I'm sort of joking, so that because it's not heavy and serious, but I'm serious as well. Like sabbatical really means someone goes away. And the system of the church figures out who they are if that person is gone. So it will show us everything wonderful about her ministry here and everything we miss, right? It'll show us where there are gaps, because actually we should be doing that or someone else should be doing that and she was doing that, right? All that is going to happen. And it's always a little messy, but that mess is for us, right? It is not for her. So God bless us, we're going to do this real well. No doubt in my mind. We're good at messy things. Speaking of wonderful transition, we're talking about God today. We stay in this conversation about God. We're going to come back to this in the fall. You're going to hear this in a lot of how we talk and preach. And we're going to have at least one kind of larger meeting after church to talk about what this means for us, how we think about inclusive, expansive language, how we think about images of God, and all the different ways we can think about that as a church. So the idea is that we're not set. I don't have something I want you to know and I want you to believe me. We're in a process of thinking, and again in these times, after a couple of years of isolation, of facing some tough things on the news and in the world around us that continue to come up, different than 5 years ago, frankly, different than 3 years ago. We are called in every generation, and theologians specifically take on this idea, right? Theology, the ology of God, is to understand where God is among us, who God is among us, how we discern that together, and how we speak it, what God calls us to. These are enormous responsibilities and tasks. The gift of the church, and there are different kinds of churches, different churches do this differently. In our tradition, we do it together. Now, if there's something that's just a tiebreaker kind of issue, we've got a bishop who tells us how to call that, right? If there's something, if a community is just veering off and is violent or conflicted or troubled, right? I get to call that, like the rector calls that. But that's not who we are. We are just living in community here. And the best of us is that we collectively discern together. You see that language in our core values. You can sort of hear it in our mission and vision, that we discern all the time. Now, there are kinds of discerning that you do if you're trying to figure out what to do with your life. That's one kind of discerning. Important. We try to be prayerful and thoughtful about that at the right times. Can't do it all the time. It's too stressful. Sometimes you guys live your life, right? And communities too. We can't do it all the time because we've got to do some things. You want to accomplish some things. But times like this are exactly the right time to put on our discerning hats, to be discerning, because so much has changed. How that's changed you, how that's changed your table, how that's changed us, we would have to talk to each other to find out, right? And many of us would have to start a conversation to even know how we have changed, what we need. As specifically as the God that you needed or knew in your childhood, the God that you might have challenged or rejected in your high school, young adult times, right? The God you might have come back to when you realized you were responsible for human beings in this world, right? Or the God you came back to because life fell apart and strangely God was there. Or the God you came back to because someone you love spoke of God, right? Or the God you never left, but wondered why God had left you, right? These are the lives we live. Around these tables, you all are living these lives. And a church is a place, I believe, where we bring all that together. Maybe a God for you that has never fit within the bounds of how the Episcopal Church defines God. But still you sit here because it's your tradition, right? Or maybe you come from another tradition and you find yourself here. All of that is us in this community. We are completely unique and none of it is new. The tradition can hold this. And it always has. So last week we talked about images of God, and it was a little bit playing around. I know you all have a bigger sense of God than any of those images, and yet the studies show us that actually we're pretty caught up in images, most of us. That's how we live, right? So it's good to see what those images have been, what they can be, and I'm sure for you some that you didn't see at all last week. This is about words for God. And so again, I don't have an end determined in this. We will work on some expansive language for the fall, make sure our liturgies reflect that. We've done that before here. There are feelings around what we do on Sunday, but I've not heard any criticism or pushback about expansiveness, that we don't want to limit God to a gender, right? But if you have that, please do. Happy to talk about that. But that's a gift in many church traditions, many parishes in this diocese and in the Episcopal Church. These are tough conversations. I don't anticipate this as a tough conversation. I anticipate the conversations you're going to have around the table and that we'll have in the church is inviting more parts into the conversation. So you, right? This is not for me to divine for you how you should think about God. This is for how you are experiencing God to be reflected in the liturgies of this church. Do you hear? And I'm very, very serious about that. So that means your experience. You might have a very traditional experience. You might be someone for whom the tradition has always worked. There are people like that. Frankly, there are very few people like that at St. Luke's, but there are people like that, right? It's just a feisty group here. That's who you all are. But yet, you come to a very traditional service. There are other ways to pray. Right? There's not a person here who doesn't know you can't go walk in your garden or in the forest or on a trail and talk to God. It's one of the gifts. You all know that. Every one of you know that. Everyone watching online knows that. And you come into this very, very traditional space, into a very traditional form of worship. I do too. I choose this. So we're not contesting that. So if that feels scary for you, just know we're not contesting that. We choose that. We choose what we understand as the tradition of Christian liturgy here. But we have some choices around the words we use, and we are responsible for how we represent God here. So when the windows and the murals and the art were being purchased and designed for this church, they didn't call the bishop and say, what are we allowed to do? They called artists and said, I want to tell this story. I want to build a new church. This is who we are, and this is what has emerged. Right? And the same, you can see it in this room as well. You call artists, you call designers, you call people that think about this stuff, and they wrap us in images of God. When we write a prayer book, we call a committee together of theologians and people that care about liturgy, and they, God bless them, present to convention after general convention drafts of documents that usually, frankly, that start out poetic and beautiful, and committee after committee refines, and you have been in those committees, right? And we get what we have, which is beautiful, but I sometimes wonder how beautiful that first thing must have been, right? Before, or poetic or lyrical it must have been, before we tried to get it right in these committees. But the committee, for us, is how we discern. We gather people together with different concerns, different backgrounds, to look at something to come and then to bring that together. So today, this is a step one. We've got some more to do, and let me read you a little bit, and then I'm going to invite you to some conversation around your table. I know some of you are grimacing because I've said that, but it's going to be great. I promise. It's going to be wonderful. You're going to talk about God in your life, and I have 2 questions for you. And if you're alone when we start that conversation, please do join a table. And if you're at a table where you know everyone real well, have a look around and see if there's somewhere else that you'd like to hear and to contribute. So let me start with this. Our friend Barbara Brown Taylor writes this in her book about moving away from the church in a desire to be about God. And let me just say right at the beginning, the reason we're having these conversations is I don't want any of you here to move from this church so that you can be more about the God you know. Let's do it here. Let's make this the place that you can come and that you would come. So this is what Barbara writes, though, and as she did it. She, in her desire to be about God, a desire that she discovers while teaching world religions to undergraduates after a long time as a beloved parish priest. She is a famous writer and preacher in our church. She writes this: disillusionment is literally the loss of an illusion about ourselves, about the world, about God. And while it is almost always a painful thing, it is never a bad thing to lose the lies we have mistaken for the truth. She continues, most of all, I want to suggest that God is just as graced by the possibility of spaciousness as we are. For years, I assumed that the only person suffering within my cramped Christianity was me. But now I wonder if God, too, feels caged in by our tiny, closet-sized faith lives. What if the religious worlds for which we were so carefully prepared limit God as much as they limit us? Maybe God is asking for room too, room to exist in our lives in God's full, multifaceted complexity. Walter Brueggemann describes the experience this way: the world for which you have been so carefully prepared is being taken away from you by the grace of God. A reminder that we are talking about God in light of resurrection, which means to me that Brueggemann's idea of old things falling away and new understandings emerging is a theme that we will be continuing. Last week I showed you some images of God. This week we will talk about our language for God. In the same way that classical ideas of God seem to persist in our imaginations, whether we were ever taught them or not, classical ideas get attached to the language we use for God and its implications in the world. For example, if God is white, then what is black or brown? If God is male, what is female? If God is a person, what are animals and plants and the land? If God is in Jerusalem or Rome, how would we name the God of the Okefenokee Swamp or of Peachtree and Sweet Auburn? The New Zealand prayer book that we all refer to so often, we do because it does this so beautifully. When you read their prayers, you hear about the landscape of New Zealand. It is so exotic and bizarre to me. I've never been there. Right? They talk about their plants and their trees and their waters, their people, in the way that a New Zealander would, even their English, right? Using local images and ideas and landscapes in all their prayers, and we must too. So on this Mother Day, is God like a parent? Is that heart opening for you, or does that shut you down completely? Is God like living water, cleansing, thirst quenching to a desert people, rare, essential, restoring itself, changing in form and yet the same, eternal? So last week I asked you to fall back on images of God, looking for where we get stuck. This week, I invite you to talk expansively about God. If it feels like exploring even as you're talking, I think that's great. So find your table, plan to find your table if you're not at one already. Here's my question for you. What is God to you? Who is God to you? It's a big question. I'm going to say each of you take about 2 minutes and pass it around the table. Make sure everyone has it. What is it? Not what has it been, not what do you hope, but what is. Find your words. And if you find some words that really resonate for you, will you send them to me? Because we're going to be working on this for a while. What is God for you? And you can't really talk about that without talking a little bit about why. And there's no wrong answer. This is not a moment where if you have a very traditional understanding, this is not a moment where you're wrong. No one's going to correct you, right? We're not correcting each other. We're asking people to speak. We're inviting people to speak from their hearts. There is no wrong answer, and let's not correct or inform each other. If you've got a question because you want to understand, like a question for clarity, please do ask that. But otherwise, let's honor what people at your table are saying, and even if it helps to say amen at the end as you pass it along, try that. We're going to go till everyone gets to speak around the table that wants to speak. I'm not going to stop you, but if you could try to take about 2 minutes, and then I'm going to watch, and we're going to try to pull it back together. All right. So, who or what is God for you? And please find a table if you're alone, and if your table's got too many people, please distribute yourselves to one that will let you talk. Will you raise your hand if your table needs more time? All right, then I'm going to start to wrap up. Thank you all for those rich conversations. I could hear a little bit of a few of them, and I'm very curious. Amazing. So let me say something. So I was in a church in London on a Sunday morning, and it was just regular church. It was good, kind of expansive, very much like a St. Luke's before I knew you all. Smaller, a small church, and kind of messy and small and wonderful. And at the end of it, they walked to the back to say the blessing. They processed out, and the priest said this blessing, which I had said out loud at the parish many times as a college chaplain, but I had never heard it said by anyone else. So it was prayed over us, over me, right? May the God who dances in creation, right, who shakes our lives like thunder, who lives to disturb and heal us, bless you with power to proclaim good news to the poor. I couldn't stop crying. I had said it so many times in my life, said it for my students, can say it by heart, right? Sometimes through a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer at the end, in case the formula hadn't made sense to somebody. And I was just crying, standing there wondering why. It was a good church, but it wasn't great church, you know? Why? Like, why am I wrecked? And it's because I need to know that God is alive in the world and with me. And that language does that for me. I know everybody doesn't need to do that. So the God who dances in creation, I could not feel more seen, right? God, the creator, that's the Nataraj, that's Shiva, that's creating right now. Creation is never over. The God who dances in creation, who shakes our lives like thunder, the thunder of crucifixion, of resurrection, of the tomb rolled back, the thunder of injustice in the world, of a broken world, of tragedy, of violence, shakes our lives like thunder, who shows up in the thundering places, who lives to disturb and heal us. Doesn't the convicting power of the Spirit disturb all the time, disturb our communities, disturb us? And doesn't it stand next to us when we know we cannot be healed and somehow we are comforted, right? Just named it for me. That's Janet Morley, a Methodist woman, a British Methodist. Methodists worry less about the correctness of things like this than Episcopalians do. But wow, does it work for me, right? But it says something to me about me. What I find reassuring and comforting and powerful and worth crying about is that God is in the world with us. I need to know that. But I know that everyone isn't like that, right? That I'm supposed to go do something about it, proclaim good news to the poor, that I can do that because of these things. I needed to hear that. I need to hear it, right? Part of the work we're doing is, what do we need to be reminded of, right? What touches us in that way and compels us in that way? So from your conversation, or something else came to mind, can we kind of popcorn, but civilized popcorn, that I'd like to hear this style? Will you say it from your table, what you heard about attributes of God or names of God?
Brian said that when they pray at home, they say they pray to the God who we know by many names.
Nice. The God who we know by many names. Anything else? What would y'all talk about at your table? Nothing.
Josephine said that God corrects us sometimes. That really struck me. Not in a
Yeah.
talking about are we being judged or not, but just in a way, like you said, that thundering presence of you thought maybe you were doing what you're supposed to do, and maybe even get reset.
God who corrects us. Yeah. God is a compass. Wow. A compass. Yeah.
Taylor came up with the word God as process, and it was easier to assign attributes to that, like all-encompassing, evolving, coming out of the whirlwind, because it wasn't anthropomorphic. I mean,
Yep.
it was a very spiritual, everywhere.
God is a process because it is not anthropomorphic, so not a person, all-encompassing. What else did you say? Basically, all the verbs, right? Like the ings, right? Movement, right? That. So not anthropomorphic, but moving and alive, right? Wonderful.
I love what Glenn said, that God is the blue in the ocean and the green in
The blue in the ocean and the green
the grass.
in the grass. As we learn more about blue, that's fascinating, right? Yeah. What is blue? Yes, Marie.
I was surprised at our table that each of us in some way spoke to the desire for the feminine side of God.
At Glennis table, they talked about the desire for the feminine side of God. Elaine?
Carol talked about how in her ministry within the UU Church, their default, if you will, is to the feminine side of God. And I love what she said about that. First 1,000 years, God was masculine. Seems fair, second 1,000.
I'll try to wrap that up. So the first 1,000 years God was masculine. The second 1,000, or we in the third 1,000, wherever we are, God it right. So back to anthropomorphic. If we're gonna, how do we gender? And this is an ongoing. Exactly what's happening in this room is exactly the struggle of the church, right? Can we know our tradition? Because through incarnation, I'm having trouble saying it. God becomes a person for us, right? God. It's a very unusual way to go about this, right? God becomes a person, just like us. So actually, being embodied, incarnation, is a value for us. What you experience in your body is made sacred. We say both in its creation, but also restored again. At least theologically in our minds and our thinking, by God coming to make this sacred, this experience, this very ordinary experience, sacred. But then how do we do that without gender? Because we experience our bodies in gendered ways, right? We experience them in very particular ways, right? And so we're hearing about that the church has named God as man for a very, very long time. And I guess we all have our opinions about how that's gone. So maybe there's more. I heard even more assertively from the back, but maybe there's more. Anything else? What else came up at your tables? Well, we're right at about time. You guys did a great job. Please do keep going with this conversation. We're going to do more. We're going to keep talking about this. I would invite you to look around your church, the fine St. Luke's Church in Atlanta, and see what images for God we have. If we have any, have a look. Let me not assume anything. And then we'll need that data for some conversations later, but let us know what you see, and we'll have this conversation again. And then also, please listen in our liturgies for what words do you hear about God in prayer, and if you use resources for prayer, what words are you hearing for God? What are we doing unconsciously or subconsciously to ourselves, and so that we can think about what we mean to be doing, and how we want to be forming our children, and how we ourselves want to be formed to see the world and what is sacred in it. So let us pray. God of no names and of all names, creator of the world creating, stir up in us a love for you that drives us to seek you out and to try to name you for the sake of your love. Amen. Thank you all.